Good evening, everyone. And I have to admit, I'd seen Max's film a number of years ago, and in recalling the events of that day and the individuals that we interacted with over those few hours, it's quite amazing. And I'm not sure, as much as it's been held out and said that I might be able to provide a greater insight into the events of that day. Probably best I can give you my insights into that day, because I think Max has done an incredible job of capturing a number of different aspects of that day and what this community lived through. One of the things that did catch my attention at the beginning was the sense that we live in a place. We live in a place that is close. The fact that we come together in an event like this, recalling this, draws a lot from the community that we come from. The sense that we want to be with one another in these types of events, a time to pull close, a time to be with loved ones. For a number of us that day, while that was an ideal that we had, the task or the jobs that we were forced with, whether it was with the organization I was with the RCMP, or whether it was with other emergency measures organizations, there were some great volunteers in this town as well. We were forced to run toward the landing aircrafts as opposed to take another choice. Just to give some context, there's a lot that's missing on this day. There probably will be a lot missing in time to come of what really went on there. And it really all comes down to the function that I had that day, to whether or not we get further answers or continue to wonder. What caused the events, how the events were explained, evacuation orders that were given, communication that was had between parents and young ones, and that is the art of the communication, how we tell our story, what we say, and the actions that come of those things. So very much, there was a short shot of me that day at the airport, and like the hair and the eyesight, some of that has fallen off. So these are very much my recollections, and the true and exact details, well, that's what Wikipedia is for, and a lot of what Max's research was. So I hope you'll give me some of that liberty. I want you to understand sort of my place, because I had been a relatively, well, no, not a long-term resident, as most Yukoners think of long-term, but I had lived in the Yukon for nearly 11 years. I was a husband to my wife Jan, who is here in the audience, and I was a father to a young son. And so much of what we all felt that day was somewhere in what I was feeling. The need to protect, the need to care, the need to ensure safety. My official function with the RCMP, well, because we were a small group here, the functions were many. My official job was I was the official planner for Yukon RCMP, or what is called the M Division. In that role, I also had communications, and it's interesting as I listened back to some of the footage and CBC that morning saying, we've got Al on the air. It speaks to the closeness that we have, and the fact that Al, everybody could understand who Al was, maybe, and that maybe they'd heard him before on the air, and that was all very good. I was also, at 9/11, I was also the team leader of what you saw in some capture there of the emergency response team. Our emergency response team in the RCMP is, for everybody that watches American television, SWAT. For all of the anti-terrorism shows, it is those mostly gentlemen dressed in black pajamas that take on dangerous duties. So I'll give you some insight into that. Although on the day that we're going to talk about, I had been called to do the duties of communications functions. So like so many, well, like everybody, I think, woke up that morning. And I woke up, as I do today, listening to CBC radio. And of course, by the time CBC comes on the air, the first aircraft had already run in to the tower in New York. So that, you kind of wake up, and I can remember lying in bed, waking up and hearing this and sort of thinking, well, that's quite different. But we wake up this morning listening to tornadoes and earthquakes and all things, and it's sort of our first glimpse on the morning. But within minutes, a second aircraft had hit those towers. And so how do we respond? I had been called out of bed at all times of the day and night, whether it be with an ERT pager or call for service in remote locations. So I jumped out of bed. I said to Jan, I said, you know what? I think today is going to be a little different. I said, I think I got to go to work. And I left for work very early that morning. And John Grant, the retired inspector with the beard, speaking on behalf of the Mounties in the film. You know, when we got to work, my office was right next door to John's. And I walked in, and is John here, just by any chance? No. So I walked into John's office. And, you know, the office was kind of in a bit of a buzz. It's an emergency response, 24-hour operation. Things come and go, things happen. But there was this uncertainty, this unsure nature in a field of operations that's usually pretty sure of itself. Might not always get it right, but it's pretty sure of itself. And there we were upstairs in John's office, and we were watching the news. Because really, to that point, even as an emergency service, we hadn't begun to contemplate the response that we were going to have to put together that day. So we were watching the news. About 7 o'clock our time, we're watching the news, and the unthinkable happens. One of those towers crashes to the ground, virtually obliterated. And I can remember looking at the TV and just not being able to contemplate that. Turning to John and saying, did I just see what I saw, or is that some sort of replay? What was that? And just that sense that while you're an organization that's supposed to have some faculty of control, you've been thrown into various situations that control was starting to slip from your fingers. That you weren't the ones pulling the strings, and that ultimately there was going to be a lot of responsibility. We were all grappling with the magnitude of what was going on. The understanding, without any toll, the understanding that death had just taken place in a massive way that none of us that hadn't lived through a war or a massive tragedy had ever experienced before. We saw in New York first responders, namely the fire department, but others as well, caught in the midst of that. And so then you begin to wonder, what impact will this have on us? What was our response? How would we deal with it? The early response was a pretty easy one, really. I mean, not in the sense that we were going to receive thousands of people from around the world on airlines, 10, 12, 14, whatever the number was that was going to land, and have to deal with that in conjunction with all of the partner agencies. Those people that would assist in looking at the deplaning of those people, their communication needs, their medical needs, the period of time that they would be here. A joyous time in some cases. Good Lord, it's already been referenced that there is a Broadway play about Gander, Newfoundland. And you know what? If Whitehorse had been called to that task that day, well, we'd be challenging him on the streets of Broadway and in the theaters of New York for our own play, because no one would have outdone Yukon in the response we would have had to that. And gladly taken that, the one we had to put up with. So the airspace is closed. We get notification that the airspace across North America is closed. That's going to force aircraft down to available landing places throughout North America. We were going to get somewhere between 10 and 14 jets here, and our response was more or less going to be a civil response. A response that required the organization that I worked for, the RCMP, to do what it does really every day, to work with others, to pull together the resources, to do, as Brian Kitchen said, to work with EMO and all the other facilities and faculty within the town to be good hosts to people that landed. It was a task, a magnitude of numbers. That was the order of the day, the response to many and not to a few under some very specific circumstances. And that's how we began our day. That's what we began thinking of. We would have a division operations center or a DOC. It would be in our boardroom on the main floor. We would link our services with those of the territory, and everything would work out. Time would pass, people would go on their way, and we would go back to our life. Policing as a whole wouldn't be altered that day. Now, shortly after 9 a.m., our time, received a call from CFB Winnipeg, Wing 17 of the Canadian Air Force. This is Canada's NORAD. This is the home of Canada's connection to NORAD. And while there is one in Alaska, at the Air Force Base there, Canada's connection to it is through Wing 17 in Winnipeg. They advised us that we would be receiving a call from NORAD Central. NORAD Center is in the mountain in Colorado. Very serious bunch of people, very serious location. And that they needed the name of the individual that they needed to speak to. Our commanding officer that day and during the time of this event was a fellow by the name of Darryl Medill. And Darryl went on to be a deputy commissioner in the RCMP in Ottawa, looking after all contract services, places like Yukon and the Northwest Territories and British Columbia and Alberta. And provided Darryl's name. And NORAD called, and we put the call through to Darryl. And that changed our response. That is when NORAD told us, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that we would be the receivers of a suspected hijacked airline. Now, you got to put that into perspective, because we're not a place in Alaska or the lower mainland of British Columbia or Colorado that has piles of military resources, incredibly well-trained response agencies for this type of thing. We're a small, northern, rural, limited resourced, limited trained arm of the RCMP. Even today, we represent about 134 people policing your whole territory. When the call came, they confirmed that there was an aircraft suspected of being hijacked. That Air Force planes out of Elmendorf had been scrambled and were in pursuit of it. And that they would cover that flight in and across Canada's border. Now that speaks something to Canadians. Those aren't our planes, they're their planes. They're not under the direct command of Canadian forces, and certainly that day they didn't have Canadian interests at hand. They had the interests of safety, they had the interests of the U.S. public at hand. And so there was a lot of things that went on, much of what Max's film will allude to, that we'll never know. Likely will never be released until most of us are probably gone and the expiration of those records go. We had that day the confirmation, although it wasn't alluded to until sometime later. We had the confirmation that day that if that plane indicated hostile action or hostile movement or failed to comply, that it would be shot down. We understood that. We understood that that was, although we hadn't had the privilege of a conversation with the Prime Minister of the day, Prime Minister Chrétien, that had been confirmed through Canadian authorities, and it's certainly been given by the U.S. authorities in Alaska. So that changes our response. That changes our role in that response, and it makes us think differently, because it is a very different situation now than receiving on a humanitarian effort a bunch of planes. We did this with the understanding that Alaska was already taking action. Alaska had already begun to evacuate major centers, large installations of their government, large hotels, schools, universities. And in fact, their governor had given order for all ships inbound with fuel or loading with oil at the terminals in Alaska to be turned to the sea and pointed outwards. We were in a world of unknown. This was not something that when I went through the Swing and Arm Ranch in Regina as a Mountie cadet, that I had any idea what to do. And the realization, contrary to your film, Max, is this could happen here. That was the premise we had to work on, is that if this went bad, this could happen here. So we moved from a civil response, where we were just a partner, to a primary response responsible for safety. So let's contextualize a little bit what we had to work with. At that day in Whitehorse, we had about maybe 30 or so resources. 30 or so resources, from the commanding officer to John, to those that we deployed in the emergency response team, and I'll speak to them a little bit, to those that were here at the airport, those that were covering road blockades and assisting in other functions within the town. Now just imagine, that's about that many people to deal with that situation from a police perspective. It immediately required us to set 2 commands up. Previously, we would have had a command downtown. We would have worked with the government and EMO on their side. And in this one, we then had to set 2 commands. So we had our main downtown command, which had connections to Ottawa, had connections with NORAD, the air traffic response from that end, and our headquarters in Ottawa. And then we had an airport command. And John Grant and I and a number of others were dispatched to the airport, where we were to deal primarily with on-site response and actually to have eyes on the ground. I'm not sure what that would have done, but anyway. If there had been radio silence, maybe it had gone really bad. I don't know. Our ERT responses, they look ominous, and they're well-trained. They're very dedicated. All of the equipment that they have, they can use very well. But having led that team, I can tell you that day, we had 6 people in an F-250 truck on the tarmac. We had 2 on the airport roof. And the people on the tarmac in that F-250 pickup truck, there's none of them because it wasn't a thing in Canada. I mean, there were a few at Toronto Airport, there were a few in Montreal, there were a few in Vancouver that had actually been trained on how to do a very, very specific entry into an aircraft. It's called a tubular assault. It's not easy. It doesn't go well in any event, but it certainly has a higher percentage if you've had some training. And we hadn't had any. So it wasn't good. And of course, I don't know if you saw the size of that airplane, if we all remember it, right? I mean, it's immense. You know, our extension ladders weren't going to get to the door. And anyway, so that's our response, right? That's our response. And of course, the other part of it comes with, you know, this doesn't have a playbook. That, you know, you don't just go to the operations manual and dial up, you know, 747 hijacked in a remote rural northern community. There it is, the plan's laid out for you. So we were pretty much in uncharted waters. Uncharted waters with a lot of variables, like a lot of things off to the side. And I won't profess for a moment that we got everything right, that things couldn't have gone terribly wrong. They really could have, you know. But I think that when you look at the magnitude of the decisions, the limited resources, and a certain amount of flying by the seat of your pants, it wouldn't have been unexpected that we got some things wrong. Some of the things that we got wrong, I think, are the tenet of Max's film. You know, the evacuation of schools in downtown. To this day, you know, we may have 2 or 3 roads out of here. You know, that wouldn't change today than it would, you know, back 16 years ago. Schools and the location of our downtown, proximal to the airport, complicate things. Because it wouldn't have taken, as we can all imagine, those of us that saw that plane land and take off, those of us that were downtown or up at the airport, could only see that it didn't have to go too far to the east, and the landing strip looked like 4th Avenue. So there was some issues with that. Evacuation seemed like a simple solution, right? It's what you do. It's the way you create open space. It's what they're doing in Florida. It's what they did in Houston for natural disasters. You evacuate and you create open space. Open space is safe space, except that there's chaos and there's no way to get out of downtown. And people are coming back into downtown because that's where their loved ones are and that's where their kids are. And so that's where the best waylaid plans, the best ideas, the simplest solutions don't go as well as planned or as expected. And certainly the criticisms and the questions that were asked of us in the report done after the event, and probably to this day, can be borne by those decisions. We also have to remember, you know, as we look back, sometimes we look at things as we see them today, and of course, today is not 16 years ago. Those of you that tried to pick up your cell phone that day probably didn't have much success with it. You got to remember that today, or this week or something, is the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. So not only were we not dealing with the best of technology held in our hand, but the infrastructure and the systems that were around were collapsing as the cell net jammed and then failed. And so we were left to communicate with two-way radios, to try and find hard lines, to dial and redial cell phones, to try and get the communication out. And so you would have heard and you saw the text of communications through media. Not social media that we could have relied on today, but through the media. Calls that were heard only if you had your radio on, and only particularly if you had CBC on. The calls for the communication and the requirement to maintain those and update those were critical. But they could only be done when we had access, when the one guy that was running around that had access to the media could get through to them and had time to get through to them and had a message to give to them. And that was the reality of it. There was little information to work with that day, As much as people think we were flooded and withholding and being able to formulate plans and detailed actions and provide people with an update, we were in a vacuum and making it up as we went along and then trying to communicate it. And so it wasn't that there was just heaps of information. We were trying to analyze it, pull it apart, and give it to the public in a way that they could understand and react to it. There just wasn't a lot of information. And John said, the first call that, the first understanding we had of that plane that was coming in, suspect of being hijacked, was that it was going to be here in 15 minutes, right? That didn't turn out to be what it was, but nonetheless, if we'd have told people that it would have been here in 15 minutes, that wouldn't have been good either, right? So there was communication void for us, and in the critical communications between those people responsible with that responsibility and the public, there were delays. And so the response came with the calls to evacuate, the realization, as many of the people on the film said, that this was potentially happening here today. And what did that conjure? Well, it conjured emotions. It conjured fear. It conjured panic. It would do the same today with the experiences that we all lived 16 years ago. Because fear is brought about by the unknown. Fear is not brought necessarily by the present. In fact, most of us respond relatively well in the present to fear. We either run or we stand and fight. It's the fight or flight. We're built like that. But when given time to contemplate the magnitude, to recall what they'd seen in the morning, to hear the chatter, to realize the separation from their family, the emotion becomes panic. The panic becomes anger, and it becomes just sort of awe, just all-encompassing. I'm going to give you a personal story on that front, because I had no time for fear. That wasn't the job that we were employed to do, to have fear. We were really still in the responding process, so I guess some of us were there standing and fighting. As much as we might have been wanting to run, that wouldn't have been any good. But I have a personal story to give a perspective, I think, to what we all experienced in one way, shape, or form. So my wife was employed by the government of Yukon. She worked downtown. Our son, who was 3, I guess he was about 3, just about 4, he was at a daycare, a private daycare, a friend's house, actually, just across the road here in Hillcrest. Now, the highway was blocked from just north by the bluffs there, where the ARC, where the Adult Rehabilitation Center is, to just south to here. So what's caught in the middle, right? So when my wife went to try and find our son, and of course had no communications, when she went to try and find our son, she couldn't get through. The road was blocked. It was blocked for everybody. She had no idea where our son was. The proximity of this airport, that airplane, total chaos and catastrophe, and Hillcrest is pretty close. So the sense of that fear, the sense of that panic, the sense of that helplessness was immediate. And it was for everyone. And I can understand that. I can understand that sense that you're out of control or you've lost control. Not that you're running around crazy out of control, but that you've lost those things that are within your realm to control. It was a story of a conversation that took place in that F-250 pickup sitting out on the tarmac here, waiting for a great big 747 to arrive. As the plane got closer, we started to get more and more information, more from the air traffic controllers in terms of how long they were going to be here, how long it was going to take that they were going to get here. And there they were, sitting in that little truck, great big plane coming. Somebody looked down the bench seat at the other guy and just joking, right? Because they're all amped up with black humor and the sense of the situation. Buddy looked at the other guy and said, "So, your will complete?" He didn't have to respond because the look on his face was, "Nope." So everybody is taken up with this response. And we wait. And we wait. And the minutes seem at some points like they're running as seconds, and in other times the minutes are running like hours. And John Grant alludes to watching the plane. And John and I were standing side by side in a boardroom. I don't know if it's a boardroom now, but it was a boardroom then in the corner of the airport. The air traffic controllers were there. It's all glass. John and I are standing with our faces against the plate glass like this, and the plane's coming down. And there is a total sense of we have no control. At this point, we are controlless. And that plane lands. Now, there's a lot of things that went on in the communication. There's whether or not that text was a spelling error, whether it was something just by happenstance ends up, whether it was an electronic glitch, what the whole issue around squawking 7500 was, whether they were asked to squawk, whether they confirmed a squawk, whatever the case was. The fact that they were otherwise, to the eye, on procedure was probably a lifesaver. There's questions of, was the people in the north more disposable than the people in the south? I don't think that was part of the equation. I don't think that was given a thought as to best crash that airplane in Whitehorse than anything else. We are the flyover for many locations. We would have been the flyover for 10, 12, 14 planes that day on a civil response. And so there's no real reason that on that given day that was a reasonable place to put that plane down. It had already overflown, and today that same air flight still occurs. Flight 085 is still a flight from Seoul to Washington or to New York. It doesn't have to stop any longer because it's flying different equipment. But at that point, it was a stop for fuel and for passengers. And is fueled not for the maximum distance of the aircraft, but based on how far it's got to go, how many people it's got on board, and how much the weight of the packages it's carrying, because that makes it efficient. So the fact that it was running out of fuel, it wouldn't have made anywhere else. It wouldn't have made Edmonton, because Edmonton was considered. Would it have been better to land it in Edmonton? Well, not if Edmontonians are more disposable than Whitehorsers. So I'm not sure that was an equation. But there was something in the art of communication that broke down. Now, I don't know, I'm not in that business anymore, so I might be telling secrets that are out of school. But I'm sure at the internet today, you could probably find the answer anyway. So there was a breakdown in communication to the very, very end. When that plane landed, and it taxied from the south end of the runway, all the way past where John and I were, past the air traffic control, parked the north end on the tarmac, parked there because that was the only place on the tarmac that would withhold a loaded 747 at that day. there was a call made to the pilot. The last-ditched pitch for whether or not his aircraft was under siege. It's a tactical pitch. It's a pitch that gives those on the ground a better opportunity of approaching that aircraft. And the pitch was, if you're under siege, approach your parking spot on the tarmac with your flaps down. And as he went past the windows, the flaps were down. And I won't say what I said to John. So there was a breakdown. There's undoubtedly a breakdown. There was a breakdown between Canadian authorities, American authorities, a disparate desire in outcomes, a disparate focus on what was important that day, a different way of dealing with it. The U.S. and the American controllers turning over an aircraft to Edmonton that was squawking an international code for hijack. Now, John mentions that there wasn't a language barrier, and I'll take that for what John says. There was not a language barrier in the cockpit. There was, with all respect of the culture, there was a cultural difference in the cockpit. The Korean pilot was a very seasoned, well-respected, flown for Cal Airlines for many years, done an exemplary job. His first officer in the right-hand seat was a young fella, and there was no opportunity in that culture to join in a team effect on what was going on. A question and answer, two heads are better than one response. The interview of the pilot provided insight into what had taken place and what the pilot had interpreted. What the pilot had interpreted as direction, and what he had interpreted as his reaction. And there's nothing the matter with that. There was a slightly different version from the first officer. Not so much in what the interpretation or what the call is, but what the response might have been. A breakdown in communication. Two people sitting side by side in charge of an aircraft. And so I come back to the whole issue of the communication. If we look at 9/11, it was a statement. It was a statement by a hostile group with a real deep hatred for another group. It was an expression of a communication. Communication that day, as I was responsible to communicating to the Whitehorse public, in the same way, if it wasn't clear, if it wasn't concise, if it wasn't able to be understood and reacted to, then it didn't get its outcome. I hope that the actions of 9/11 in New York failed to provide that outcome. We live in a very different world. Brian Kitchen and the others at the end of the film indicate that some of the things that we have grown very used to is an outcome of that day. That day, no matter where we were or what we were doing, communicated to us a change. So this didn't change things as there was about 215, I think, passengers, thereabouts, Max. And I think on the plane, I think there's about 12 or 15 crew. So there was still a welcoming party for those folks. It was a little different. But many of the same needs needed to be met. And you know, I gotta tell you that once those folks got to the ground, once those folks were escorted off the plane, and began to understand the magnitude of what had taken place in the world that day and what all had happened around them. It was amazing. This community was amazing. We had medical things that had to be dealt with. We had communication gaps. We had a bunch of different food requirements, housing requirements. We had no idea how long they were going to be here. The airspace remained closed for quite a while after. And so all of that in maintaining them was also a real challenge. But one that I think that everybody here, and as I walked in, I see at the back, I see people that were part of our victim services group at the detachment at the time. And we called upon volunteers. And that's when we collectively came together as a community to respond and to hold out that hand of surety to people who were completely bewildered and unknowing to the situations. That plane sat on the tarmac here for a day and a half or thereabouts. We got permission because of where it was going. It was going to JFK in New York. We got permission and we were required to give a full search of that aircraft. And so when the skies over North America were virtually closed, we got the permission to fly up a bomb search squad out of Vancouver to really the only response outside of the eastern seaboard, for a response to search an aircraft in that respect. And they came up and the plane was searched, because what we didn't want is exactly what somebody had alluded to. And that was, it land and everything's okay and then somebody hits the button, right? And we certainly didn't want to be responsible for that once it got under its way. And it did. It finally took off. And it's one of the strange things that rings out of the whole event was being told sometime later how many lights that aircraft blew out on its takeoff on the runway. Because of course the second set of jets hung out beyond the width of the landing strip where all those lights are that we see when we fly in, right? And what's there? Well, there's gravel. And of course, when those big jets rock up, they just took every light out of the runway. And I thought, well, we'll gladly pay for that to get you the hell out of here. But anyway, at the end of that day, there was calls on my desk from every media agency on just about every continent. There were contacts and phone numbers from New York, from Washington, from LA, from England. And you know what? I looked at the list and I kind of went down it, and we prioritized local and regional first. We're going to tell the story to the people that matter first, not that are interested in the magnitude of it. And there was many of those calls that we never responded to. And the day, although it ended sort of, midday for the landing of the aircraft, the day went on for quite a while. And when I finally was coming down from the airport, been contacted by As It Happens, a current event show. Can you imagine current events on 9/11? A current event show on CBC. And they were asking for an interview on what had taken place in Whitehorse. And I'd done lots of interviews. I'd done lots of interviews locally and on different things, good and bad. And I can remember pulling over in the little vehicle that I was driving, and I actually was right in front of the detachment. And I gave this interview by cell phone. Cell phones were working, to As It Happens. And as I listened to the questions, and there was probably many people that were here or around Canada that were listening, really none of the responses mattered. Right? At the end of the day, the responses were just white noise to the day. And I think it was captured in the film that at the end of the day, when we all got home, when we were able to realize that the event had passed, that we were in the arms or the presence of those that we loved, that as much as the events around us had changed, we were unharmed. The people that we loved were still here. The threat was more or less neutralized for us, and that the Whitehorse and the Yukon that we had woken up to, believing we were miles away, was coming home. That we were, and we continue to be, in a safe place. A place that's understanding, a place that's caring, a place that is law-abiding and understanding. And that's the tenet of the communication, that we are very fortunate. I want to thank Max again for the airing of this film. I'm not sure that I lived up to the billing, that I would tell you secrets of things you didn't already know, or that we're going to shed great light on the events that took place that day. I'm certainly willing to take questions if you have any, and if not, I want to beg your indulgence. Thank you very much. They told me I would come and speak to maybe 25 or 30 people. I said, that's okay. I've spoken to a lot of high school classes. I'll be able to handle that. I was shocked and amazed. It speaks to Whitehorse that the parking lot was full when I arrived here at 20 to 7. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.